Welcome back to the Coaching and Sports Fitness Training Discussions. Today we're going to talk about nutrition. We're going to talk about basic concepts and a discussion. Nutrition is the process of providing or obtaining the food necessary for health and growth. This is obvious and should be obvious to most of us, but even the best of us cannot see the importance of nutrition in our health. And so just being able to see this basic definition may give us different perspectives of providing and obtaining the food necessary for health and growth. That's what we want to do here. So let's talk about that a little bit. We're going to have 4 concepts that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about macronutrients. We're going to talk about carbohydrates and the glycemic index. We're going to talk about micronutrients. And then we're going to talk about why we want to eat varied and why we want to eat clean and avoid processed nutrition. So the first section, macronutrients. Macronutrients are nutrients in food that provide the body energy. And so the 5 macronutrients are listed there. We have fats, proteins, carbohydrates, water, and alcohol. And you can see here that fats are a lot of olive oils, coconut, butter, meats. Proteins, you're looking at salmon and nuts and some other fish, cheese. And then carbohydrates, we're looking at breads, potatoes, lentils, pasta, corn. So those are the 3 big ones that we talk about frequently in our own daily lives. And you might see on nutritional packages, we have fats, proteins, and carbohydrates listed. So that's where most of our calories come from. And then we have water. Water is essential to all life. It's essential to our human bodies to function properly. Does it provide us with calories? No, it does not. But what about just being essential to function? And so it has been considered a macronutrient in today's age. Alcohol is another one. Alcohol actually does provide the body with a specific amount of energy per gram. It is a non-essential macronutrient. So if you do the math on a nutritional label for an alcoholic beverage, you'll notice that when you multiply the fats, proteins, carbohydrates by their respective calories per gram and add them up, they do not add up to the serving size. And that's because alcohol is providing that energy that's not listed on the nutritional label. Now, when we talk about macronutrients, we talk about how many calories they provide. Each macronutrient provides a different amount of calories per gram. So fats provide 9 calories per gram, proteins provide 4, carbohydrates provide 4, water provides 0, and alcohol provides 7 calories per gram. Structural macronutrients. These are used to build the body's cell structures, their muscles, the cell walls, etc. That is fats and proteins, and that's something important to remember. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but just remember that structural macronutrients are fats and proteins. They build the body's muscles, the cell walls, and such, and really help with our structure as a whole. Carbohydrates, on the other hand, are only used for energy, either immediate energy or stored energy, and so that's what carbohydrates are used for, which we're going to talk about in the next section. This is called the glycemic index. This next section is called the glycemic index. It's all about carbohydrates. So when we talk about the glycemic index is a system that ranks foods on a scale of 1 to 100 based on their effect on blood sugar levels. So you list them 1 to 100, and you get the effect on the blood sugar levels. 100 being digest very quickly and spikes blood sugar levels, blood glucose levels. Lower foods digest much more slowly and don't provide as much of a spike, as you can see there to the graph on the left. So you can see that graph, very useful. So blood glucose levels and then time, and you can see the red line is a high glycemic food, whereas the orange one or the yellow one is a low glycemic food. All right, so you can see that here. So what about the glycemic index? All right, now what happens here is we have high blood sugar, and it goes into the pancreas. The pancreas, uh, or the high blood sugar promotes insulin release from the pancreas. The pancreas releases insulin, and then the insulin takes up the excess blood sugar and puts it into fat tissue cells, which lowers blood sugar. Now, I'm going to go back to the last slide. As you can see here, something with a high glycemic index will have this high blood sugar spike. A lot of insulin will be released. It'll take up all the excess sugars, it'll store them as fat, and then what do we get? We get this crash that occurs. You notice how blood sugar levels drop below the low GI line. So you have this crash. What happens when you have blood sugar crash? You get hungry again. You crave sugar again, which means you want another high glycemic index food. You do that again, and then you store it as fat, and then you crash again, and then the cycle just continues to repeat itself over and over again, whereas low glycemic index foods tend to normalize blood sugar levels, normalize those appetites and that drive for high glycemic foods. So here's a chart on glycemic index. You can see here this is broken into different types. So we have grains and starches, vegetables, fruits, dairy, and proteins. There are some carbohydrates in things that contain proteins, higher proteins like peanuts and lentils and kidney beans and split beans and lima beans. So you can see a lot of beans on this end. The dairy tends to be a little bit lower on the glycemic index as a whole. Fruits tend to be a little bit more mid-range on the glycemic index. Vegetables tend to be a little bit lower on the glycemic index. And then grains tend to be a bit higher on the glycemic index. There are a couple that are lower, but generally speaking, most of them are higher. Even whole wheat bread, when we talk about white bread versus whole wheat bread is definitely lower on the glycemic index than white bread is. White bread's way up there in the 90s, not even on this chart. But as you can see, whole wheat bread is still a high glycemic food regardless. So that's something important to remember, is that just because it quote unquote seems healthier because it's whole wheat or whole grain, doesn't necessarily mean that it is healthier for you. So that is something to take into consideration, is that marketing, all right? Marketing is a big thing here where, yes, whole wheat bread is absolutely lower on the glycemic index, helps with those blood sugar levels, helps with the cravings that we may get, but it's still a high glycemic food as a whole. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide here. So this kind of just shows a rating for foods as a whole. We have glucose, which is 100, all right? And then we work our way down from there, all right? So you can see as we keep working our way down, and we have peanuts and cherries lower on the glycemic index, whereas potatoes, glucose, carrots are much higher on the glycemic index. So how should we eat? Generally speaking, this first line here, generally speaking, foods lower on the glycemic index will allow you to feel fuller for longer. All right. Generally speaking, foods lower on the glycemic index will generally normalize blood sugar levels and mitigate fat storage. And generally speaking, foods lower on the glycemic index will contain more micronutrients than those higher on the glycemic index. All right. So those are things that we generally want to eat, things lower on the glycemic index. They just tend to be healthier. I'm not going to steer you away from carrots. I like carrots. I think that they're healthier on the spectrum. They have a high glycemic content, but that's generally okay for me. But understand that in a general sense, things lower on the glycemic index have more micronutrients, make you feel fuller, and normalize blood sugar levels versus those things higher on the glycemic index. Now, this last point is what we're going to dive into next, something called micronutrients. So micronutrients are vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals. So vitamins, we may all know what vitamins may be: vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin D, C. All right, I have a bunch of them listed over here. as you can see, okay? Um, and all of those things there help with body processes. They do not provide energy. Micronutrients do not provide energy, but they provide essential functions and essential content for the body to use to function properly. So that is vitamins, that's minerals, all right? So your phosphorus and your iron are all minerals. There's one last bit of micronutrients that you may not have been exposed to, which is phytochemicals. Phytochemicals are chemicals that come from plants that aid in body processes. So when we talk about phytochemicals, we're talking about ones that are not particularly defined that much by governing bodies. All right, they are not as deemed essential as the vitamins and minerals. They're not as deemed as essential as fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, but there is something to be said for them. So there are a few different phytochemicals that are out there. I will talk about one for you. So there's one phytochemical called lycopene. Lycopene is in tomatoes. All right. So when we talk about lycopene, it's in tomatoes. All right. Actually, you can see a tomato down here. Tomatoes also provide B6. So when we talk about tomatoes and talk about lycopene is a phytochemical that aids in heart health. And so that was a study that was done in the 80s, 90s time frame that showed that lycopene helped. There was a suggestion that it helped with heart health. That is phytochemical. There are many of them out there. There's garlic. Garlic has a phytochemical in it that it has antimicrobial properties that help with fighting off bacteria and viruses. So these are things that we want to understand, that phytochemicals do help with body processes, and they do help with all of that. And that is one point to come into play. Now, I do want to talk about lycopene for a second. So lycopene was known for heart health. All right. Guess who took it over? It was the ketchup industry. The ketchup industry took phytochemicals. It took its lycopene and it said, oh, tomatoes contain lycopene. Ketchup is made from tomatoes, so therefore ketchup contains lycopene, and ketchup is good for heart health. So the next question is, why do we want to eat less processed foods? This is where that debacle came into play, where processed foods, all right, any type of processed foods, and we'll talk about processing soon, heat, chemical, sunlight exposure, juicing, dehydration, all damage phytochemicals. They damage micronutrients and vitamins and minerals. And so therefore, does ketchup contain lycopene? That is a question for you. All right, does it contain lycopene? So that's what we want to talk about now, is why do we want to eat less processed foods? There was a vitamin C study done where they took an orange off a tree and tested the vitamin C levels. Then they juiced it, all right? They freshly squeezed it. And then they immediately tested vitamin C levels. Then they stored it in a refrigerator for a week. And then they tested the vitamin C levels. How much vitamin C was left after that week of being picked off the tree, juiced, and stored in a refrigerator for a week? Think about that answer for a second. How much vitamin C is left? 50% decrease in vitamin C levels from one point to the next. All right, from the orange to 1 week of stored fresh orange juice contained 50% lower vitamin C levels than the start. All right. Then I want you to think about, all right, if it's 50% of just that process, how much vitamin C is in pasteurized orange juice with preservatives? How much vitamin C is in juice that traveled from the manufacturing point after it was pasteurized and placed with preservatives to the bottling plant, to the warehouse, to the distribution plant, to the price chopper on Main Street, into your refrigerator, stored in your refrigerator for 1 week before you finish it? That is a question for you. How much vitamin C is left in that orange juice? These are questions that I want to bring up to you that are more worldly perspectives, that I want you to understand what you're eating, what you're putting into your body, and make judgments for yourself. Do research for yourself, because there are a lot of things out there that we're not entirely sure of. Processed foods damages macronutrients, damages and destroys micronutrients. All right, something that we want to keep in mind. So we want to avoid processed foods for those particular reasons. Processing techniques may be heat, chemicals, sunlight exposure, juicing, dehydration. A big one is time. You see best by dates. A can of green beans is not going to kill you by eating it past the best by date. It's just going to be broken down a little bit more in the can than it was before. And so therefore it will not contain as many micronutrients as it did before, because those will be damaged and destroyed. Now, there are some good things about processing techniques. I don't have any off the top of my head at the moment, any specific examples for you off the top of my head at the moment, but there are some good ones where cooking something for a short amount of time, 2 or 3 minutes in a pan, may release certain chemicals, certain phytochemicals, vitamins or minerals that will be more readily absorbed by the body. And so those things do exist. So do know that processing as a whole may not be a bad thing. It's just, what type of processing are you eating? Are you eating home-cooked meal food processing, or are you eating manufactured packaged food type of processing? So the next question is, why do we want to eat varied? And so we want to eat varied for 2 reasons. One is eating and completing a full spectrum of macronutrients and micronutrients, proper macronutrients, proper micronutrients. There are a lot of plans out there that you can find on Google, nutritional courses in different health studies classes and such. I'm not going to focus on those, all right? But knowing that eating and completing a full spectrum of proper macronutrients and micronutrients. And then the other reason we want to eat varied is something called nutritional food pairing. Nutritional food pairing is something where you're eating possibly 2 different foods that help absorb macronutrients and micronutrients in each one of those foods. So, to give you an idea, calcium is most readily absorbed with the absorption of and presence of vitamin D. Vitamin D is most readily absorbed in the presence and catalyzation of healthy fats. And there's a need to eat healthy fats and not to avoid them. There's a myth out there to take out as much fat as possible. And so there are fats that are good for you. Complete fat-free cheese. How much processing does that go through? How much nutrition is that actually providing you? So I put a couple nutritional food pairings down for you. Calcium with vitamin D, salmon and broccoli. All right. Then you have vitamin D and absorption in the presence of healthy fats, olive oils and tomatoes. All right. I do even have a citation for you versus whole milk versus skim milk. And children who drink whole milk have a much higher level of vitamin D in their body than those children who drink skim milk. And that's probably because of the presence of fats, vitamin D, and calcium all at the same time that allow for readily absorbing minerals, micronutrients, and macronutrients in the human body. All right, so that's a little bit on nutritional food pairing and why we want to eat varied. So our summary for today, we talked about macronutrients, we talked about fats, proteins, carbohydrates, water, and alcohol. We talked about their calories per gram, and we talked about that fats and proteins are structural macronutrients. Carbohydrates are only used for energy and are based on the glycemic index, which show how quickly carbohydrates are digested by the body. Those who are higher on the glycemic index digest much more quickly, which provide a much higher blood glucose spike, which does quickly store that excess glucose and blood sugar as fat. Now, granted, things lower in the glycemic index help mitigate some of that risk of blood sugar spikes and also provide more micronutrients on a general basis. Micronutrients are considered vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals that help and aid in body processes. They may not provide energy, but they help you stay healthy. And we want to eat less processed foods because processed foods do damage macronutrients and damage and destroy micronutrients. And we want to eat varied foods so we can get a complete spectrum of proper nutritional health, as well as get these tips on nutritional food pairing. So that way, instead of eating vitamin D for no apparent reason on an empty stomach, that just goes through our body, we can actually readily absorb it into our bodies. And so that is a summary on nutrition for you. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you back here on the next discussion. Thank you.